Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the deep expanse of the galaxy, beyond the reach of familiar constellations, humanity had advanced to the point where space was no longer a frontier but a realm of exploration, innovation, and sometimes rescue. Captain Mike Strayer, a seasoned explorer and scientist, stood on the bridge of the Solaris, gazing into the abyss of space. His mind was consumed by the mission ahead, the one that brought a sense of urgency unlike any he had encountered in his 20-year career. The signals had come from a distant planet on the edge of a dark matter field, an anomaly that defied explanation. Dark matter was a force that could bend light, distort space, and consume entire star systems, but until recently, its effects on planets were poorly understood. And now, this mysterious planet, barely visible on their instruments, seemed to be swallowed whole by the encroaching void. It was the last hope for a dying galaxy, and their mission was to save it. "Captain, we're approaching the dark matter zone," said Dr. Claire Voss, an astrophysicist and one of the brightest minds in the scientific community. She stood beside him, her sharp blue eyes scanning the holographic display of the planet. Preliminary readings suggest that the planet's core has almost completely collapsed. "If we don't act soon, I know," Mike replied, his voice steady but laden with the weight of responsibility. He had led dozens of missions, but this one carried stakes that were unimaginable. A planet on the verge of collapse was one thing, but the presence of dark matter, an enigma that humanity had yet to fully grasp, made it far more perilous. Behind him, the rest of the crew was preparing for descent. Dr. Jason Meyer, the lead engineer who had played a key role in the development of the photon technology they would rely on, was calibrating the ship's systems. His brow furrowed in concentration as he made adjustments to the photon reactors, the cutting-edge devices that could harness the power of light to combat dark matter's pull. These reactors were humanity's most ambitious scientific achievement, and now they were the only thing standing between the planet and total annihilation. Mike walked to the central console, his fingers brushing across the controls as he reviewed the mission parameters once more. The stakes couldn't be higher. Failure meant not just the destruction of the planet, but the collapse of the entire star system. "We've received word from command," Claire said quietly. "They're putting all their faith in us. If we succeed, well, they're already planning to name the system after you." Mike gave a tight smile. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Claire. We haven't even landed yet." The planet loomed before them, a black silhouette against the faint starlight. Its surface was barely distinguishable from the void that surrounded it. Dark matter swirled in chaotic patterns, pulling light inwards and distorting the space around them. The crew had dubbed the planet Obsidia for its dark, glassy appearance, but it was nothing more than a decaying husk now, its core cold and dying. Jason glanced over his shoulder. "Photon reactors are primed and ready. But once we're down there, it's going to be a hell of a ride. We're talking zero visibility, gravitational distortions, electromagnetic interference, the works." "Piece of cake," Mike said dryly, earning a chuckle from Jason. Humor was how they coped in situations like this. It was easier to laugh than to dwell on the fact that they were about to land on a planet where the laws of physics barely applied. The Solaris descended through the atmosphere, or what was left of it. The ship's shields flickered as they passed through waves of dark matter. The planet's surface was unlike anything they had ever seen. Dark, jagged formations stretched across the landscape, warped by gravitational anomalies. The ground itself seemed to ripple, as if it were caught between dimensions. Every step would be a risk. "Landing zone secured," the pilot announced, and with a soft thud, the ship made contact with the ground. Outside, the landscape was barren and alien, an unwelcoming wasteland that pulsed with the remnants of the dark matter invasion. The air was thick with energy, the kind that made your skin tingle and your thoughts race. Mike led the team down the ramp, his helmet's visor flickering as it adjusted to the erratic light. Claire and Jason followed closely, along with two other members of the crew, Lieutenant Harris and Specialist Lynn, both trained in exoplanetary geology and energy systems. The plan was simple in theory. They had to locate the core chamber, an ancient, long-dormant mechanism deep beneath the planet's surface, and deploy the photon reactors. Once activated, the reactors would flood the core with light energy, reigniting the planet and pushing back the dark matter that had taken root in its core. Simple in theory, but in practice, it would be anything but. The ground crunched underfoot as they advanced toward the core chamber's coordinates. Each step felt heavier than the last, the gravity pulling at them in uneven waves. Time itself seemed to blur as they walked, minutes stretching into hours in the chaotic environment. Electromagnetic interference is spiking, Jason muttered as he checked his instruments. Our equipment's struggling to stay online. Mike nodded, glancing at Claire. She was focused, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. How far are we from the core chamber? He asked. Less than a mile, she replied, her voice tense. But with this interference, it's hard to get a clear reading. They continued onward, the landscape growing more surreal with every step. Dark matter had warped the planet's surface in ways that defied explanation. Rocks floated above the ground, tethered by invisible forces. Shadows moved where there was no light, flickering in and out of existence. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and a low, ominous rumble echoed through the air. Earthquake? Harris asked, gripping his rifle tighter. No, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not an earthquake. That's the core. Mike's pulse quickened. They were close. Too close. Let's move, he ordered, quickening his pace. The others followed, their boots crunching against the uneven terrain. As they approached the core chamber, the air grew heavier, charged with energy that crackled like static. Finally, they reached the entrance to the core. It was a massive structure, half buried in the planet's surface, its metallic surface tarnished and warped by the dark matter. The door was sealed, its ancient mechanisms long since rendered inactive. This is it, Jason said, stepping forward to examine the door. The core chamber's directly below us. We just need to get inside. Mike gestured for the team to spread out and secure the area while Jason worked on the door. Claire knelt beside him, helping to interface with the ancient technology. They worked in silence, their focus absolute. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they worked. The door's mechanisms groaned and protested, but finally, with a shuddering hiss, it slid open, revealing a long, dark corridor that led down into the core. Let's go, Mike said, taking the lead. The descent into the core chamber was unnerving. The corridor was narrow, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper into the planet. The air grew warmer, and the faint hum of the core's energy resonated through the walls. When they reached the core chamber, it was unlike anything they had ever seen. The chamber was massive, a vast, open space with a central energy well that pulsed faintly with the last remnants of the planet's dying core. Dark matter tendrils snaked around the edges of the room, creeping toward the well like a predator stalking its prey. This is it, Claire said, her voice barely audible. The core's still active, but just barely. If we don't act now, we're doing this, Mike said firmly. Jason, get the reactors ready. Jason nodded and moved to the center of the room, setting up the photon reactors. Each reactor was a sleek, metallic device designed to harness light energy and convert it into a stabilizing force. It was their only hope of reigniting the core and pushing back the dark matter. As Jason worked, the rest of the team stood guard, watching the dark matter as it crept closer. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. Finally, Jason stood up. "Reactors are in place. We're ready to go." Mike stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment they had been preparing for. He placed his hand on the activation switch and took a deep breath. "Let's light this planet up," he said, and with a flick of his wrist, he activated the reactors. The effect was immediate. The photon reactors hummed to life, flooding the core with bright, pure light. The dark matter recoiled, hissing and writhing as it was forced back by the energy. The core itself began to pulse with new life, its energy well glowing brighter with each passing second. "We're doing it," Claire said, her voice filled with awe. "It's working." But just as they began to celebrate, the ground trembled violently, and a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. The dark matter, though weakened, was not defeated. It surged toward them in a final, desperate attack, lashing out with tendrils of energy that crackled with malevolent power. "Hold the line," Mike shouted, raising his weapon as the team prepared to fight. The next few moments were chaos. The dark matter lashed out at them, striking with the force of a tidal wave. Mike and the others fired their weapons, but it was like fighting a storm. The air crackled with energy, and the room was filled with the sound of explosions and the desperate shouts of the crew. In the midst of the chaos, Jason was hit. A tendril of dark matter struck him full force, sending him crashing to the ground. "Jason!" Claire screamed, rushing to his side. Mike fought his way through the chaos to reach them, but it was too late. Jason's suit was compromised, and the dark matter had already begun to consume him. "Go," Jason gasped, his voice weak but determined. "Finish the mission." Mike hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "We won't forget you." With a final burst of energy, Mike and Claire activated the remaining reactors, flooding the chamber with light. The dark matter shrieked as it was forced back, dissolving into nothingness as the core flared to life. The roar of the dark matter echoed one last time before it vanished, dissolving into nothing as the light from the photon reactors grew brighter and steadier. The oppressive weight that had filled the core chamber lifted, replaced by a sense of stillness, an eerie quiet that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded. Captain Mike stood in the center of the chamber, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the now pulsing core. The photons danced around it like ribbons of light, illuminating the vast room. It was working. Against all odds, they had done it. Claire knelt beside Jason, her hands trembling as she checked his vitals. His breathing was shallow, and his face had gone pale beneath the visor of his helmet. The dark matter's attack had ravaged his body, and the damage was irreparable. "Jason," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. He opened his eyes slowly, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "You did it," he rasped, barely audible. "The core, it's alive." "You saved us," Mike said, crouching beside them. "You saved the whole system." Jason shook his head weakly. "We did it together," he replied, his eyes flickering as the light around them grew more intense. "Just promise me, keep pushing forward. Make it count." Before Mike could respond, Jason's eyes closed, and his body went limp. Claire let out a small sob, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of loss settled over them, bittersweet in the face of their victory. Mike stood slowly, his face set in grim determination. There wasn't time for mourning. Not yet. They still had to get off this planet, and he had no idea what the side effects of reigniting a dead core might be. He glanced back at the reactors, now running at full capacity, and motioned for Claire to rise. "We have to move," he said quietly, but firmly. "Jason wouldn't want us to stay here. We have to get back to the Solaris." Claire nodded, wiping the tears from her eyes. "You're right," she said, her voice steadying. "We need to finish what we started." They made their way back up through the narrow corridor, the walls vibrating slightly as the planet's core continued to stabilize. The ascent felt longer than the descent, but it was clearer now, more stable. The dark matter had receded, its grip on the planet broken, and the strange gravitational anomalies that had plagued their journey down had faded. But the planet wasn't safe yet. The seismic activity was growing more frequent, and the air was filled with a low hum, like the rumbling of a storm on the horizon. When they emerged from the core chamber, the landscape looked different. What had once been a bleak, desolate wasteland of dark matter and warped terrain was now beginning to resemble a planet on the brink of rebirth. The ground still shimmered with residual dark matter energy, but the light from the core was pushing it back, creating patches of normalcy amid the chaos. Mike activated his comms. "Solaris, this is Captain Strayer. Do you copy?" Static crackled in his earpiece for a moment before the pilot's voice came through, faint but clear. "Copy, Captain. We're picking up massive energy readings from the planet's core." "Did you?" "We did it," Mike said, glancing at Claire. "The core's reignited, but we're not out of the woods yet. The planet's still unstable, and we need immediate extraction. How's the ship holding up?" "We're ready for you, but the dark matter is still causing interference. I'll bring the Solaris as close as I can, but it might get rough." "Understood," Mike replied. "We'll be at the extraction point in 5. As they moved across the uneven terrain, the ground trembled again, and a distant rumble echoed across the horizon. The planet's transformation was in full swing now, but it was violent, an eruption of energy that threatened to tear the surface apart. Mike could feel the urgency in the air, the sense that time was running out. They reached the extraction point just as the Solaris descended through the atmosphere, its engines roaring against the pull of the planet's gravity. The ship hovered above them, lowering a set of cables for them to latch onto. "Let's go," Mike said, securing the cable around his waist. Claire did the same, and with a signal to the ship, they were lifted off the ground, ascending toward the safety of the Solaris. As they rose, Mike looked down at the planet below. What had once been a dying world consumed by dark matter was now a place of light and energy, its core pulsing like a newborn star. The mission had been a success, but at great cost. They boarded the ship in silence, the ramp ceiling shut behind them. The roar of the engines drowned out their thoughts as the Solaris lifted off, breaking free of the planet's gravity and setting course for orbit. In the quiet of the ship, Claire removed her helmet, her face pale and exhausted. Mike followed suit, his mind still racing. They had saved the planet, but Jason's death weighed heavily on him. He had been more than just a colleague, he had been a friend, someone who had believed in the mission as much as anyone. Claire sat down in the nearest chair, her head in her hands. "I can't believe he's gone," she whispered. Mike didn't have the words to comfort her. He sat beside her, staring out the viewport as the planet grew smaller in the distance, the light from its core visible even from space. The mission had been a success, but it didn't feel like a victory. After a long moment, Claire looked up, her eyes red but resolute. "We have to report back to command," she said quietly. "They need to know what happened down there. What we accomplished." Mike nodded, his expression hardening. "They'll know," he said. "But this isn't over. Dark matter is still out there, and we barely understand it. We've bought ourselves time, but the fight's just beginning." Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a moment before she nodded. "You're right," she said. "But we'll be ready. We have to be." The ship's comms crackled, and the pilot's voice broke the silence. "Captain, we're clear of the planet's gravity well. Setting course for home. ETA is 6 hours." "Roger that," Mike replied, his voice steady. "Let's go home." The journey back to Earth was quiet. The weight of what had happened on the planet hung over the crew, a mix of exhaustion and grief. But as they neared Earth's orbit, the sight of their home planet brought a sense of relief, however brief. The Solaris descended smoothly through Earth's atmosphere, and as they approached the landing site, Mike could see the crowd gathered below, scientists, engineers, military personnel, all waiting for news of their mission. When the ship touched down, the ramp lowered, and Mike and Claire stepped out into the cool air. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landing field. The moment felt surreal, as if they had been gone for years instead of days. A group of officials approached, led by Commander Reynolds, the head of Earth's Space Exploration Division. He was a tall, imposing man with a grizzled face and a no-nonsense demeanor, but even he looked relieved to see them. "Captain Strayer, Dr. Voss," Reynolds greeted them with a nod. "Welcome back. I understand you've had quite the mission." Mike exchanged a glance with Claire before turning back to Reynolds. "The planet's core is reignited. The dark matter was pushed back, but we lost Jason." Reynolds' expression softened, and he nodded grimly. "I'm sorry for your loss. Jason was one of the best. He gave everything to make sure the mission succeeded," Claire added quietly. "We couldn't have done it without him." Reynolds nodded again, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "The galaxy owes him, and all of you, a great debt. This isn't the end, though. We've barely scratched the surface of what dark matter is capable of." Mike crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "We need more research, more resources. The next time we face dark matter, we need to be ready." Reynolds looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "You'll have it," he said. "Whatever it takes." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the landing field in shadow, Mike felt a sense of resolve settle over him. The mission was over, but the journey was far from finished. They had saved a planet, but the galaxy was vast, and dark matter was just one of many unknowns waiting in the void. But no matter what came next, they would face it together, as they always had. And with every step forward, humanity would prove that even in the darkest corners of the universe, there was always light.